The story of Dennis Morgan is not just about an actor who faded away, it's about how Hollywood itself can erase someone, not with scandal, not with shame, but with silence. Imagine a man who had it all. The looks, the voice, the charm, the contracts with Warner Brothers, the adoring fans who swooned over his every smile. And yet, decades later, when you mention his name, most people hesitate, their brows furrow, their memories blank. How can someone once so big become nearly invisible in Hollywood's history books? The answer is not simple. It's a tale of power, loyalty, betrayal, and an industry that thrives on consuming its own. And as we peel back the layers of this forgotten life, you'll see why Dennis Morgan's erasure wasn't an accident. It was engineered. But before we dive into that story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Our channel exists to uncover the lost stories Hollywood doesn't want you to remember. By supporting us, you keep these hidden histories alive. Now, let's go back to the golden age of cinema, where a young man from Wisconsin was about to conquer the screen. He was born Earl Stanley Morner in 1908, far from the glittering lights of Los Angeles. The boy who would later become Dennis Morgan didn't begin life destined for fame. He sang in churches, trained his voice for opera, and carried himself with the manners of a Midwestern gentleman. But Hollywood, hungry for clean-cut faces and bankable charm, was always on the hunt for men like him. When Warner Brothers laid eyes on Earl Morner, they saw not a farm boy but a brand, a perfect canvas on which they could paint their next romantic hero. And so Earl was remade. His name became Dennis Morgan, and with it came the promise of stardom. In the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood was a machine that could transform nobodies into gods of the screen. But like any machine, it had gears that crushed just as easily as they built. Morgan signed the contracts, played the roles, and stepped into the carefully manufactured identity Warner Brothers carved for him. He was the smiling suitor, the affable hero, the dependable leading man who never threatened to shock or scandalize. Audiences adored him. His face lit up the screen, his voice charmed every scene. The rise was fast, and Morgan's roles defined a certain kind of American dream. He starred alongside the biggest names, Bette Davis, Ginger Rogers, Jack Carson, and he shone as the embodiment of what the studio wanted: stability, handsomeness, and safety. Unlike Errol Flynn, who swaggered across screens with wild unpredictability, or Humphrey Bogart, who carried shadows in his eyes, Dennis Morgan was designed to be sunshine. And sunshine sells, until it doesn't. Behind the polished image, there was unease. Warner Brothers never fully trusted Morgan's singing, at least not in the beginning. In some early roles, his voice was dubbed, a humiliation for a man who had trained in opera and prided himself on his vocal gifts. But Morgan stayed quiet. He played the game. He knew that rebellion could end a career as quickly as it began. While other stars fought, clashed with producers, or risked headlines with scandal, Morgan stayed loyal. He smiled for the cameras, played his assigned roles, and never raised his voice against the hand that fed him. For a while, it worked. In the 1940s, his name drew crowds. His on-screen partnership with Jack Carson became a reliable box office duo. Women adored him, men admired him, and the studio was pleased. He embodied wartime optimism, the boy-next-door hero who sang about love and never let you see him bleed. Yet even as he thrived, Hollywood was already changing. Shadows were creeping into the movies. Film noir was rising, the world was weary from war, and audiences no longer wanted safe smiles. They wanted danger, grit, and broken men. Dennis Morgan, with his polished perfection, suddenly felt like a relic. And here lies the seed of his erasure. Hollywood doesn't forget stars who scandalize, it remembers them forever. But those who are too safe, too steady, too unwilling to disrupt the system? Those are the ones who disappear, erased not by disgrace but by neglect. In those early years, Morgan couldn't see it yet. He was still climbing, still believing that loyalty and obedience to Warner Brothers would guarantee his place in the pantheon of stars. But the truth was cruel. In Hollywood, safety is deadly. And Dennis Morgan was about to learn that playing the game too well could cost him his legacy. The Hollywood studio system was a gleaming palace on the outside, but for actors like Dennis Morgan, it was a gilded cage. Warner Brothers controlled everything: the scripts, the image, even the off-screen behavior. Contracts were ironclad, dictating what roles he could take, how he appeared in public, and even when he could smile for photographers. At first, Morgan accepted it as the cost of stardom. After all, he was working steadily, his name glowing on marquees across America. But what he didn't know was that the same system that built him up would eventually lock him into roles so predictable that they suffocated his career. Every studio had its typecasting game, and Warner Brothers was no different. They saw Morgan as the charming crooner, the dependable romantic lead who could woo audiences without stirring controversy. Again and again, he was placed in musicals, light romances, and feel-good dramas. It worked in the short term, audiences liked him, critics found him pleasant, and his films made money. But there was a problem. Pleasant doesn't make legends. Stars who endured, like Bogart, Davis, or Cagney, were allowed to flex their grit, to embody raw edges that cut into the culture. Morgan, by contrast, was polished smooth until nothing dangerous remained. He was the safe bet. The studio executives could count on him to show up on time, deliver his lines, charm with a smile, and never cause a scandal. And yet, safety is what doomed him. As the 1940s gave way to the darker, more cynical post-war years, audiences were demanding something new. They wanted heroes with scars, men who carried shadows in their eyes, characters who could embody the moral uncertainty of a changing world. Hollywood began producing noir antiheroes, detectives with haunted pasts, gangsters with fractured morals. But where did a clean-cut leading man like Dennis Morgan fit into this new landscape? He tried to stretch. There were moments when Morgan attempted to break the mold, to take on roles that carried more weight, more edge. But Warner Brothers had little interest in risk. They wanted him marketable, bankable, predictable. So instead of gritty noir roles or dangerous love affairs, he was assigned films that kept him safe. For an actor, safety is a death sentence. The cage glittered, yes, but its bars were unbreakable. There was also the shadow of loyalty, his deep and unshakable friendship with Errol Flynn. Flynn was chaos incarnate, a man whose scandals filled newspapers and whose every misstep turned into a legend. Dennis Morgan, by contrast, played the part of the steadfast ally, always at Flynn's side, always defending him, always loyal to a fault. Hollywood loves rebels, and it remembers their sins forever. But Hollywood has little use for the loyal sidekick who never steps out of line. In Being Flynn's Rock, Morgan condemned himself to being overshadowed. Critics began to whisper, "Where's the fire? Where's the danger?" Morgan was handsome, talented, and charismatic, but critics compared him unfavorably to the giants around him. Next to the volcanic intensity of Cagney or the razor-sharp edge of Bogart, Morgan's smooth charm looked safe, too safe. The very thing Warner Brothers had built him to be was now working against him. Behind the scenes, the studio system was shifting. The contracts that once guaranteed work were becoming traps. Stars wanted independence, freedom to choose their roles, and the bold ones fought for it, sometimes breaking ties with studios altogether. Dennis Morgan, ever the loyal soldier, stayed. He believed Warner Brothers would protect him, as they always had. But protection in Hollywood is an illusion. The moment the studio sensed the audience shifting, they quietly moved on to newer, riskier faces. Morgan was left standing on the lot, watching younger stars take the kind of roles he was never even offered. And still, he didn't fight. Perhaps it was his nature, perhaps it was his loyalty, but Morgan never went to war with the system. He accepted the roles, collected the paychecks, and kept delivering the charming performances expected of him. For a while, it kept him afloat. But in Hollywood, floating is just another word for sinking slowly. By the late 1940s, as film noir dominated theaters and television began creeping into living rooms, Dennis Morgan's brand of sunny charm was becoming obsolete. The very machine that had built him was now quietly dismantling his stardom, piece by piece, film by film. His name appeared on fewer posters, his co-stars grew younger, and the roles felt smaller. Audiences who once swooned now shifted their attention to actors who dared to bleed on screen. Dennis Morgan had been a star. Now, slowly, silently, he was being erased. By the dawn of the 1950s, Hollywood itself was undergoing a transformation. The war was over, the world was restless, and America's golden optimism had been replaced by unease. The film industry mirrored that change. Audiences no longer wanted the glossy perfection of musicals and light romances. They wanted grit, danger, something that reflected the cracks forming in real life. Outlaws, troubled men, broken hearts, that was what sold tickets. And for Dennis Morgan, the shift was a quiet death sentence. His polished smile, once his greatest weapon, suddenly felt out of place. Warner Brothers, sensing the cultural pivot, began funneling resources into fresher, riskier faces. Actors like Kirk Douglas, Burt Lancaster, and Robert Mitchum brought intensity that seemed dangerous, unpredictable. These were men who could throw punches on screen and look like they had lived every bruise. Next to them, Dennis Morgan's neat hair and smooth voice seemed like relics of another era. At first, he tried to keep pace. He accepted smaller roles, supporting characters, even television appearances when the silver screen no longer called. But the truth was harsh. Hollywood doesn't let its golden boys age gracefully. Where legends like Bogart could carve their names into noir immortality, Morgan's carefully packaged charm left him stranded. He wasn't dangerous enough to play the anti-hero, and he wasn't unique enough to reinvent himself. He was, in the eyes of the industry, expendable. Critics began sharpening their pens. Reviews of his later roles often noted his pleasantness with a kind of faint condescension. "He is likable," they wrote, "but unremarkable." In Hollywood, unremarkable is the kiss of death. Audiences may forgive scandal, arrogance, even crime, but they never forgive blandness. Morgan was a skilled actor, a singer with natural gifts, a consummate professional. But in an industry that rewarded spectacle, he had none of the volatility that keeps names etched in history. And yet, Morgan was not bitter. Not outwardly. Friends recalled that he carried himself with dignity, even as the roles dried up. He never lashed out at Warner Brothers, never cursed the system that had abandoned him. Instead, he accepted what came his way: television guest spots, B-movies, the occasional nostalgic appearance. For a man who had once headlined major films, it was a steep fall. But Morgan was steady to the end, perhaps too steady. The tragedy is that Hollywood doesn't always erase with malice, it erases with silence. While Errol Flynn's scandals became the stuff of legend, ensuring his immortality despite personal ruin, Dennis Morgan's obedience meant that when he vanished from the spotlight, few noticed. He had lived without scandal, without rebellion, without headlines. And in Hollywood, no headlines means no memory. The 1950s accelerated his disappearance. Television was the new frontier, and stars who once commanded theaters now fought for scraps of airtime. Morgan made appearances, but he wasn't the kind of figure who could reinvent himself for the small screen. The rugged faces and character actors thrived there, he did not. Each passing year blurred him further into the background. Behind the curtain, there was also the cruel arithmetic of the studio system. Warner Brothers, once his guardian, had little interest in preserving his legacy. To them, Dennis Morgan was a product, a tool used to fill theaters in the 1940s. By the time the 1950s rolled in, the product was outdated, and like all outdated products, it was quietly shelved. No scandals, no dramatic farewell tour, just a man slipping quietly into obscurity. What made his erasure even sharper was how deliberate it seemed. Warner Brothers had the power to repackage stars, to reinvent them when the times changed. They had done it before, molding actors into fresh personas that fit new eras. But Morgan wasn't given that chance. Perhaps the studio thought he lacked the rawness to compete with the new guard. Perhaps his loyalty had made him predictable, too easy to discard. Whatever the reason, the reinvention never came. And so his star, once bright, dimmed without a fight. By the late 1950s, Dennis Morgan was a name audiences only dimly recalled. Didn't he star in those musicals? Some would ask. Wasn't he the one with Jack Carson? Others shrugged, unable to place him at all. For a man who had once been a staple of Hollywood's golden age, the silence was deafening. This was Hollywood at its most ruthless. It had no need to destroy him publicly, it simply erased him by moving on. The 1960s arrived with a vengeance, and with it came the final blow to Dennis Morgan's Hollywood career. The industry that had once thrived on glossy musicals and polished romantic leads now craved rebellion. Young audiences wanted actors who reflected the turbulence of the times, the anti-establishment figures, the troubled souls who bared their flaws on screen. Stars like Marlon Brando, James Dean, Paul Newman, and later Steve McQueen embodied a rawness that the post-war world demanded. Their performances weren't smooth. They were jagged, dangerous, alive. Dennis Morgan, with his golden smile and gentlemanly polish, looked like a postcard from a vanished era. There were no farewell roles, no last hurrah, where he could stake his claim as an elder statesman of cinema. Instead, his work slipped further into the background. He made occasional appearances on television, small parts that felt like echoes of his former fame. But they did little to restore his standing. Unlike his peers who reinvented themselves, Cary Grant retiring at his peak, or Bing Crosby transitioning into television specials and music, Morgan had no pivot point. He was stranded between eras, a man out of sync with Hollywood's new rhythm. As the years passed, something more insidious happened. Hollywood began to forget him entirely. His films from the 1940s, once staples of weekend matinees, stopped circulating. Studios pushed newer content, theaters replaced nostalgia with modern hits, and television syndication favored the classics that carried scandal, controversy, or myth. Dennis Morgan's name wasn't attached to fiery headlines or memorable scandals, and so it was quietly left behind. He was not the rebel, not the outlaw, not the cautionary tale. He was simply the man who played it safe. And in Hollywood, safety doesn't sell. By the 1970s, Morgan's career had dwindled into virtual obscurity. He took on small guest spots, played the occasional aging character in television dramas, but the spotlight had long since moved elsewhere. To the new generation of moviegoers, his name meant nothing. He wasn't referenced in film schools, he wasn't quoted in critic essays, and his films weren't rediscovered by cult audiences. He became what every actor dreads: invisible. What made this disappearance even crueler was how sudden it felt. One decade, he was starring alongside legends. The next, he was gone, erased without ceremony. No scandal had chased him out, no controversy had ruined his reputation. He simply became irrelevant in a business that feeds on novelty. And because he had never demanded attention, never fought for dangerous roles, never risked his reputation for the sake of immortality, there was no narrative to keep his memory alive. Friends remembered Dennis Morgan as kind and dignified, but dignity is not what Hollywood remembers. The industry thrives on myths, on fire and chaos. Errol Flynn's scandals made him immortal. James Dean's rebellion made him a legend. Morgan, by contrast, left no myth behind. He was good, solid, professional, but in Hollywood, good fades. By the 1970s, his name was a ghost. Younger stars rose, critics obsessed over rebels and scandals, while Morgan slipped into silence. He wasn't destroyed by Hollywood, he was erased by it. And that, perhaps, is worse. To be remembered for failure is still to be remembered. But to be forgotten altogether, that is the coldest fate of all. Dennis Morgan's tragedy wasn't a lack of talent, it was perfection. He obeyed, stayed loyal, avoided scandal. But in Hollywood, perfection is a curse. Legends are born from chaos. Errol Flynn's scandals, Bogart's grit, James Dean's tragic death. Morgan had none of it. He was stable, reliable, scandal-free, and when the spotlight dimmed, Hollywood had no story left to tell. In later years he appeared at the odd nostalgia event, smiling for fans, but there was no grand revival. When he died in 1994, the tributes were small, the headlines modest, and the industry simply moved on. It was as if Hollywood had deliberately swept his memory aside. And perhaps, in a way, it had. For the industry, Dennis Morgan represented a kind of cautionary tale it didn't want to retell. The story of a man who gave everything, played his part perfectly, and was rewarded not with immortality but with invisibility. His erasure was not cruel. It was indifferent. And indifference is the most brutal punishment Hollywood can deliver. But here's the truth. Dennis Morgan's legacy does matter. His films, though forgotten by many, are still out there, waiting to be rediscovered. His performances, though polished, carry a warmth and steadiness that reflected the optimism of his era. He was a bridge between the vaudeville traditions of early Hollywood and the sleek musicals that defined mid-century cinema. His loyalty, his professionalism, his sheer ability to embody the safe hero make him an important figure, not in the pantheon of rebels, but in the quieter story of how Hollywood creates and discards. Why did Hollywood erase Dennis Morgan? Because he represented the one thing the industry cannot abide: predictability. He was too smooth, too safe, too unwilling to carve his legend out of fire. Hollywood didn't need to destroy him, it simply forgot him. And that, perhaps, is more chilling than any scandal. As we look back now, decades later, his story forces us to ask hard questions. How many other stars have been erased not because they failed, but because they were too loyal, too safe, too ordinary for an industry addicted to chaos? How many Dennis Morgans has Hollywood buried under the weight of its myths, leaving only silence where applause once rang? Dennis Morgan may not have burned like Brando, or scandalized like Flynn, or died tragically like Dean. But he deserves to be remembered, not as a legend erased, but as a man whose very erasure tells us everything about Hollywood's ruthless memory. Because sometimes, the most haunting story is not the star who burned too bright, but the one who was never allowed to burn at all. If this story opened your eyes to the hidden side of Hollywood, the stars it lifts up, the legends it remembers, and the ones it quietly erases, then don't let Dennis Morgan's name slip back into silence. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another forgotten chapter of Hollywood's history. Together, we'll keep